Welcome to The Debate. Our material today, it really forces us to confront an essential psychological paradox. It's right there at the heart of the investigation. This jarring mix of apparent chaos on one hand, and then this meticulous, almost theatrical staging found at the crime scene. The physical scene is it's a massive contradiction. You've got this rambling, 2.5-page ransom note placed right next to something profoundly domestic. The victim wrapped carefully, almost swaddled really, in a blanket.
It is. It's a narrative just built on paradoxes, isn't it? We're looking at, extreme violence followed by an act of almost maternal care, and this lengthy note seemingly left by someone trying to frame someone else, or perhaps just confuse things. It really forces us to ask, what kind of psychological state could possibly produce such divergent actions?
Absolutely. And I think the central question we really have to wrestle with is this. Does this contradictory evidence, does it primarily reveal a strategic cover-up, deliberate staging driven by internal panic and a profound need for narrative control? Or alternatively, does it reflect the logistical and behavioral failure of an external perpetrator, someone operating under extreme uncontrolled stress, basically improvising? For my part, I'll be arguing that these contradictions overwhelmingly point to deliberate staging by someone familiar with the environment and frankly motivated by guilt and panic.
I diverge is really in the interpretation of that inefficiency you see. I'm going to argue that these contradictions are more symptomatic of chaotic, improvised actions. The situation, it looks like it devolved, like it went terribly wrong. And this, to me, renders the sequencing of events psychologically incoherent, regardless of who was responsible. It suggests a kind of catastrophic collapse of whatever the original intent was, rather than some calculated, albeit panicked cover-up.
See, I don't think the scene's contradictions are just random noise. I think they're evidence of someone desperately trying to impose a false structure onto something truly unthinkable. Our source material suggests this was, quote, a crime that was covered, not one that was meticulously planned beforehand. The psychological incoherence of the overall sequence, the planning, the feeding pineapple, then this sudden escalation of violence followed by careful staging, that just fundamentally doesn't match known patterns of external criminal behavior. The goal here wasn't a clean escape. It was, I think, to construct an alternative reality, to create the appearance of planning after everything has already fallen apart. That's the psychology of survival, of denial.
Argument, I do. But the sheer volume of manipulation and, frankly, the lack of efficiency in how it was done, it suggests overwhelming improvisation to me, not effective calculation. I mean, if a meticulous planner, someone familiar with a family, intended to stage a crime, shouldn't the execution have been, cleaner, more directed? The staging elements, particularly that ransom note, they seem too excessive, too elaborate. This kind of deliberate overproduction, as you might call it, suggests a desperate attempt to sell a story, an attempt that ultimately fails because it lacks practical criminal utility. The whole thing reads to me like decisions made in real time, responding to circumstances as they unfolded, rather than following some predetermined script.
Okay, let's focus then on the one piece of evidence that gives us a precise, almost unassailable timeline: the undigested pineapple found in the victim's system. This physical evidence, it acts like a physiological clock. Because we know how fast digestion works, we know pretty much exactly the narrow window of time she must have been awake and eating, and this flatly contradicts the parents' claim that she was sound asleep when they got home. The presence of the pineapple itself and the bowl and spoon on the kitchen table, that points explicitly to domestic behavior, to interaction with someone she knew and trusted, carried out by someone comfortable in that kitchen at that hour. This physical evidence, for me, is the uncontrolled truth that just unspools the entire official narrative.
Yeah, I agree the pineapple it's powerful. It's like a symbol of truth that couldn't be suppressed, biological evidence that resists that narrative control you mentioned. However, I do question maybe the rigidity of the conclusion that it automatically indicts the immediate family. What if the initial interaction was calm, perhaps involving a trusted acquaintance? The often mentioned Santa Claus figure comes up. The situation could have started with a domestic interaction, like sharing a snack. But, and this is the key point for me, this central logistical gap in the intruder theory. Why would an outsider, having successfully established trust and fed the child, then stay in the house? Why wouldn't they immediately leave? That part doesn't track for an intruder.
Right, and I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning precisely because the oversight of the pineapple leaving the bowl out is classic uncontrolled evidence. It's common in staging attempts. The person responsible, they were focused entirely on constructing the big lie, right? The kidnapping note. And in doing so, they missed the small truth, the domestic remnants that ultimately betray the constructed story. An intruder, if they'd somehow established trust and fed her, they would have fled. The decision to stay, to allow things to escalate, and then engage in hours of detailed staging and cleanup, that suggests someone who couldn't leave because they were already home.
For the sake of argument, that someone did have the time and the security implied by all this staging, let's look at the composition of the ransom note itself. We really need to analyze the complex cognitive task required to produce that 2.5-page document. That level of details composition, I mean, that's just not the physiology of someone operating under the acute stress of an ongoing violent crime. Someone who just committed such an act doesn't have the clear headspace or the calm hands needed to write a long, thoughtful letter like that. Their brain is flooded with adrenaline. They're in flight mode, not creative writing mode. So the note itself, its very existence in that form, is evidence that the person felt safe enough, secure enough to sit and think and write. It suggests the immediate acute panic had subsided, or perhaps was never present in the way we might assume for, say, a panicked intruder.
Well, I definitely understand the physiological point you're making about adrenaline. Let's pivot for a second to the content of the note, and maybe its anthropological context. Forensically, it reads like a performance, doesn't it? It's what someone thinks a kidnapper would write, likely based on cultural scripts from movies, from TV shows. It's not really a functional criminal document aiming for a transaction. And furthermore, the source material highlights that the ransom demand corresponds specifically to John Ramsey's executive bonus. Now, that is highly sensitive, specific financial information an outsider would be very unlikely to possess. This insider detail, for me, reinforces the idea that the note was a deliberate, almost theatrical attempt at narrative control crafted from within the family's sort of insular world.
See, my framework challenges that interpretation slightly. That note's sheer length and its excessive detail, couldn't that actually be the marker of extreme, desperate panic overcoming rational thought? Maybe the writer tries too hard to sell the story precisely because the underlying situation was so utterly uncontrolled. The desperation to create a false trail led them to, overdo the staging, making the final product implausible. This excessive quality, it could suggest someone whose ability to make rational, calculated decisions was just fundamentally broken by the events, leading them to focus on this kind of theatrical persuasion rather than a functional criminal demand.
Okay, let's turn then to the psychology of the postmortem care. If we accept the pineapple points towards domestic activity, familiar surroundings, how do you then explain the extreme postmortem care? JONBENET was covered with a blanket that was described as neatly folded and wrapped around her as if you would wrap a papoose. Now, psychologically, this looks like textbook undoing. It's a powerful psychological defense mechanism where a perpetrator tries symbolically to reverse or negate their destructive act. And the papoose wrapping, specifically, that's such a maternal image, isn't it? Swaddling, care. It's overwhelmingly associated in criminal psychology with a perpetrator who had a profound emotional connection to the victim. It indicates someone whose identity, perhaps as a caregiver, was performing one final, almost automatic motion.
It does raise profound questions, doesn't it? About the human capacity for contradiction. But we have to question the assumption that only a pre-existing emotional connection can lead to that kind of remorseful action. While it seems highly improbable for a complete stranger, maybe this act of care represents a collapse into shock, or profound, spontaneous remorse after the crisis point had passed, maybe enacting some deep cultural script about dignity and death almost involuntarily. We have to at least consider the possibility of tragic human complexity here, where the act of destruction was followed by a non-calculated, perhaps purely emotional, act of care. An act that speaks to a sudden, maybe even universal, instinct for preservation or dignity.
I am sorry, but I just don't buy that for an intruder scenario. That level of emotional release or performing that kind of careful action, it requires minutes of safety, security. An intruder simply wouldn't have that luxury. An external perpetrator is operating under acute flight risk. They're focused on concealment, on escape. They don't have the time or, frankly, the psychological space to spend moments enacting emotional care like that. The behavior suggests someone who wasn't afraid of being caught in the act of tending to the body. The act of careful, tender actions, it requires a physiological state free from that acute panic of flight. And that points strongly, again, towards someone who felt secure enough in that space to perform an act that was perhaps emotionally necessary for them, operating from a parent's psychology, not a typical criminal's.
But the critical point here, maybe, is that the individual responsible, whether they were an insider or an outsider, was clearly not operating from a purely strategic criminal mindset at that point. They were operating from a place of, well, intense emotional devastation or conflict or something complex, demonstrating this profound conflict where, perhaps, the need for care momentarily overwhelmed the need for strategic evasion. The central question we face then is whether that emotional deviation makes the intruder theory impossible, or whether it merely requires us to accept a far more unusual and, frankly, chaotic behavioral sequence than standard criminal profiling typically allows for.
For me, the evidence, the convergence of the domestic behavior represented by the pineapple, the physiological safety implied by the note's composition and length, and the profound psychological staging of undoing demonstrated by the papoose wrapping, it all seems to suggest a singular conclusion. Panic staging, staging by someone close, aiming desperately for narrative control in the aftermath of an unthinkable catastrophe. All the indicators, they point back to this overwhelming need to construct an alternative story for survival.
And yet, the philosophical challenge remains, doesn't it? The sheer volume of contradiction and incoherence, the rage seemingly alongside meticulous care, the precision writing combined with profoundly inefficient criminal execution. It suggests a catastrophic collapse of some situation, one where intent was lost in real-time improvisation and sheer desperation. And this leaves behind evidence that just resists any simple explanation, whether it was an insider overwhelmed by panic or an outsider whose plan failed in some fundamental bizarre way. We are forced, really, to wrestle with psychological events that seem to have defied any predictable behavioral script.
Yeah, our material forces us to try and reconcile these deep internal contradictions. Rage and remorse, chaos and meticulous order, all apparently coexisting. Perhaps the most difficult part of analyzing this material is accepting the profound psychological complexity of the events that unfolded, and really thinking about what each clue, each contradictory action reveals about motive, about meaning, pushing us to look deeper into the hidden mechanisms of guilt, denial, and maybe even that strange form of post-facto care.
Ultimately, the evidence paints a picture of a desperate human attempt, or maybe multiple attempts, to manage a situation that was utterly unmanageable. We're left trying to reconcile human beings capable, it seems, of tenderness and destruction almost in the same breath. And that profound complexity, I think, ensures the core mystery endures. It invites us and anyone looking at this to keep questioning not just what happened, but maybe more importantly, why it unfolded in this specific, contradictory way.